this very special panel, on stage, I would say, dialogue. I'm Sorindu Karu. I'm an honorary chair, the honorary chair of the New Strategy Center Scientific Board. My day job is director of the European Union Satellite Center, and I used to work with NATO as a member of the North Atlantic Council and Assistant Secretary General. And therefore, being the one to introduce on stage General Petraeus is a very special pleasure and honor, since it evokes really profound memories from the time he was coming to brief the North Atlantic Council and really setting the record straight on what happens in Afghanistan, or what the approach should be for NATO's strengthening of its defense deterrence posture. I know that I probably don't need to introduce General Petraeus because he's a bit of a legend. I mean, the name resonates, but what resonates more is the career. Distinguished four-star American general with multiple awards from the US and other NATO member states. Also former head of the CIA, but most and foremost someone that continues to leave an imprint in the political thinking and also in the international debate related to security and stability. And I'm extremely grateful for the General, because I think this is the third day since you came to Bucharest. You started with the launch of a superb book, Conflict, and then yesterday and today, so you were extremely gracious with your time and wisdom. So again, many thanks for the availability to address also this panel, which has as a key theme the challenge for the US mainly to manage multiple crisis security environment, and also to have a discussion about what concerns many in our public, about war fatigue, about the future of the transatlantic relationship, about competition with the attention on the Indo-Pacific area, and everything else, frankly, that you would like to highlight to this audience. So let me start with the first theme that I wanted to include in this discussion, which has to do with the American, I would say, the future of the American identity as the indispensable nation, as it proved to be a number of times in history. By the way, there were also alternations between involvement and isolationism. But since the Second World War, and then Cold War, and also now, US was indeed the key, I would say, player in terms of creating, shaping, defending the international order that led to a great evolution and to prosperity. So my question is, what should we expect? Is there going to be any fundamental change? There is a perception by many that the world order is collapsing. I remember one of the essays of Bob Kagan about the world that American shaped actually going in different directions. So what should we expect?
Look, I think, first of all, the American leadership in the world is very important. I think it has been the indispensable nation in both helping to craft the so-called rules-based international order that was established in the wake of World War II, which for all of its imperfections, its flaws, its shortcomings, is still done a great deal for the protection of the freedoms, the systems and so forth that we all hold dear. And I think that that will continue. There is still very strong bipartisan support. I mean, people shouldn't draw the wrong lesson from this long period of time that our House of Representatives took to approve $61 billion worth of security assistance for Ukraine, which is a colossal number. That's much more than we have provided in the first 2 years, almost 20 billion more in the first 2 years. Yes, it took too long, but it got done, and when it was done, we saw that there were bipartisan majorities in each House supporting it. So it was really this anomaly that we have in the House of Representatives. I think by and large, there is still a very strong national consensus and an understanding, by and large, that we do all of this, not because of charitable inclinations, although we do give a great deal to what are essentially charitable causes, humanitarian assistance and development aid and all the rest of that, but we do this because it's in our cold, hard national interest, that our prosperity depends on it. Again, the preservation of the world that allows, again, freedom and democracy and capitalism and so to flourish. Yes, there are encroachments. Yes, Bob Kagan's right, the jungle grows back in certain areas. Yes, there is domestic populism in certain ways in certain European countries, some in the United States. Yes, there are questions about why we're spending not just more than all of our NATO allies put together, but more than 2-point-something times all of our NATO allies put together, and why there are certain European nations that don't yet still spend 2% of GDP in defense, even as we're witnessing, we're well into the third year of a brutal, unprovoked invasion, the first of its type in Europe, again, in many, many decades. So I think all of those questions are legitimate, but at the end of the day, I think there is a recognition, even among those that support Donald Trump or support Joe Biden, of the importance of continuing to do this. But let me talk about how the world has actually changed, because I think it's pretty important to recognize what's taken place over the last decade. It's very, very profound. It's really seismic change. And it happens to coincide with the period that I've been actually in the private sector. I left the CIA a bit over 11 years ago, was hired by KKR, one of the world's largest investment firms, to establish and chair our Global Institute to do geopolitical risk in the diligence process as we're examining potential investments. And 11 years ago, when we established this, you would describe the world as one of benign globalization, in which barriers to trade, capital flows, investment, data were all being reduced, they were all going down, and global trade was going up like this. And again, in that period, benign globalization, economics largely drove geopolitics. 11 years later, geopolitics is back with a vengeance. And now geopolitics, in many cases, is driving economics. It's constraining investment, trade, and so forth. You see an emergence of protectionism in quite a substantial scale, and we're going to see even more of that as the US, the EU, other non-EU countries and Western countries become increasingly concerned about the so-called export of Chinese overcapacity. This is the world we're in now. It's a world of renewed great power rivalries. In fact, I should just note that I actually co-lead a seminar, a graduate seminar at Yale on great power competition, which is really wonderful for keeping your intellectual capital fresh for what I do for KKR. So this is quite a transformation, and we now face the number of threats and the complexity of threats that is, I believe, the greatest since at least the end of the Cold War, if not actually the end of World War II. If you think of the US and our Western allies and partners as the guy in the circus who keep a lot of different plates spinning simultaneously in a circus tent, there's more plates in that tent, and there are more complex challenges represented by those plates, again, than at any time in many, many decades. The most important is the U.S.-Western relationship with China. That plate is bigger than all the others in that tent. We can't let it wobble if we can avoid that. The Russia threat is obviously much more pernicious, threatening, and so forth than it was before. The North Korean nuclear plate, there's 3 plates for Iran, their nuclear program, their drone and missile program, their support to malign actors in the Middle East. There are still individual plates that represent Islamist extremist groups that you have to keep an eye and pressure on, and if you don't, they can reestablish, they can reconstitute themselves, just as Al-Qaeda in Iraq did. We destroyed it during the surge. We kept it down in the subsequent 3.5 years. By then, it is now called the Islamic State. We leave with our final combat forces. The Prime Minister pursues highly sectarian actions, takes his eye off the extremists, and you have the first ever extremist caliphate in modern history in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. We have to go back in, so you have to keep an eye on them. There are plates that represent cyber threats, nation state, non-nation state, criminal actors, extremist groups, all of that. There are plates that represent manifestations of climate change. So the list goes on, and the only way you can keep all these plates spinning is if you actually have U.S. leadership, but it's U.S. leadership that is working together always and treasures and values and contributes to the various alliances, international groupings, and so forth that enable us to keep all these plates spinning. Of course, for countries that are in Europe, that Russia plate is much more menacing, much more important. But you do have to keep, I think, a global perspective, and you certainly have to if you're from the United States.
Well, thank you so much. You are absolutely remarkable in showing such a great threat landscape, global threat landscape, just in a couple of minutes. So thank you very much for that.
I do it for a living.
But coming back to some of the things related to how public opinion perceives these things, and I'm trying to think from the point of view of the American public. I lived for a decade in the U.S. between UN and Washington, D.C., and I know that, yes, U.S. is between the two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and the transatlantic relationship has this strong history, but there's a lot of interest on the Pacific, Indo-Pacific dimension, and I'm really curious how the public perception in the U.S. is about this balancing act. I mean, is it really understood that even though, for example, the war in Ukraine is an European issue, of course, it's also a transatlantic issue because U.S. is here, but it actually can have ripple effects on Europe's interest over the Pacific and the China and so on. So is it understood?
Not as broadly as you'd like it to be, and a lot of us spend a lot of time reminding people that, in fact, we capture this in the book Conflict. Andrew Roberts and I make a very important point there that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in another part. If you have a red line in Syria that turns out not to be a red line, that can act, and you don't act as if it's a red line, that can undermine deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. If you withdraw from Afghanistan when you had a sustainable approach, it might be maddening and frustrating and not what we hoped it would be, but surely the United States could maintain 3,500 troops and spend $25 billion a year. We spent $100 billion a year, one year, the year that I was the commander there. And you know that it's not going to go well. It was absolutely predictable, and I did predict it, as did a number of others, that it's very likely that the Afghan security forces would suffer a psychological collapse, not just because the U.S. had left, but because our maintenance workers left, 17,000 of them, that were needed to maintain the critical component of the defense strategy, which was the helicopter and fixed-wing mobility to take the 35,000 strong, well-trained and equipped commandos out to reinforce the less well-equipped normal Afghan security forces, police and army, that were protecting the various urban areas and also critical infrastructure. And that exactly happened. And when you know that nobody is coming to the rescue, forces that previously fought very hard and took many, many, many times the casualties that we did in 20 years, all of a sudden were no longer combat capable and so on. So that sent a message to Putin, I think, actually. It definitely sent a message to President Xi. He said publicly, look at that. See, you first island chain countries, you can't count on America as an ally or a partner, and look how it went. They're a great power in decline. I don't agree with either of those, but I think that we provided certainly material that did undermine. Keep in mind that deterrence is a function of two elements, two components. One is the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities. The other is the assessment of your willingness to use them. And both of those have to be, again, rock solid. In the Indo-Pacific, we are undergoing a huge effort to transform our capabilities, to harden our bases, to put headquarters underground, to get much more of a combat theater, if you will. And having commanded a theater of war, the U.S. Central Command between Iraq and Afghanistan, is very different the way we were operating there compared with what was the operation, say, 4 years ago in the Pacific. That's very, very different already now. There's a huge effort that is ongoing. Not all that much of it is all that visible, but it is very substantial. And then we are beginning the process of transforming our forces in a very substantial way from what might be described in very simplistic terms as a small number of large platforms that are exquisitely capable, heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, and increasingly vulnerable, to a massive number of unmanned systems that are not only no longer going to be remotely piloted, they're going to be algorithmically driven. And the human in the loop becomes the human on the loop, the individual who actually programs, does the algorithm, determines the direction given to that machine, and then ultimately allows the machine to actually confirm the conditions necessary to take a kinetic or non-kinetic action. This is very, very profound stuff. It's further along than people realize, and in that theater it's very important, because keep in mind that anything above the surface of the water nowadays can be seen. If it can be seen, it can be hit, and if it can be hit, it can be killed. Yes, we can defend these. Yes, there's a lot of capability, but that transformation is very, very significant. That is ongoing. And again, I think that will contribute to deterrence, just as have the seeming slip-ups by President Biden when he has said, oh yes, of course we'll come to the rescue of Taiwan. He's done it 4 times now. This is not a slip-up. This is deliberate. Yes, his national security advisor then rushes out to the podium and says there's no change to our policy of strategic ambiguity, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what's going on around the world. Does the American public fully embrace this? Certainly not. We've always had strains of America first. We've always had isolation strains. Remember, this is led by Charles Lindbergh, the hero of America, right up until World War II. So there is history for this, and those of us who believe, as I have expressed my beliefs, it's incumbent on us and those in government still and political figures to convey to the American public that, again, we're not doing this out of the goodness of our heart. We're doing it for the cold, hard national security interest that enables what it is we do and an awful lot of the prosperity that we enjoy together with like-minded nations around the world.
Thank you. Thank you for this really very welcome points and clarification. Let's stay one other minute on Ukraine because it's so close to this region and so critical. And I want to see your perspective on 2 items. One that has to do with the concrete support that we're given to Ukraine, the West is giving to Ukraine, and then the narrative, the messaging. Why I'm saying this, because everyone observed in Europe and definitely in this part of the world, like on the messaging side, that some time ago it was, we're going to support Ukraine
as much as it takes, or as long as it takes,
and then as long as we can. How do you interpret these things? And then there were a lot of red lines that the West self-imposed, kind of, first no airplanes, and then yes, no long-range missiles, and then yes. Yep. So how do you see the way forward to kind of correct a little bit, create more coherence on this?
Well, as a former economics professor, you always begin every answer by saying it depends. And here it does depend, obviously. It's a number of different factors, including can we sustain the strong bipartisan majority in each house of our Congress? Can we maintain the support, again, broadly of the American people, even as some significant figures are questioning some of this? Can the same be said of Europe? Can Ukraine continue to generate forces? The 2 biggest factor on which the immediate future of the war depended when I was last in Ukraine, which is about 4 or 5 weeks ago, were number one, when will the U.S. assistance be approved? I was quite confident we would approve it. It did take too long to do that. But again, $61 billion is a huge amount of money. And then second, when do the Ukrainians come to grips with their challenges with forced generation? Because their conscription law is completely different than ours. When I was privileged to command our forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, the average age of our soldiers on the front lines is 19 to 22. In Ukraine, it's over 40. And that's because of their approach. The conscription age used to be 27. Now they've reduced it. They finally came to grips with this, reduced it to 25. They have now got to operationalize this new conscription. That opens up about 150,000 young men. They've got to get on with this because the vulnerability that they are experiencing right now is a result not just of the lag in U.S. assistance, where the pipeline literally went dry. It has to do with their forced generation. And this is particularly acute given the reality that they experience where they're fighting an enemy who has much more than 3 times the population that they have, has 10 times the economy, and doesn't seem to be concerned at all about casualties. And Ukraine has to be concerned about casualties. It's one reason why they're producing tens of thousands of drones every month to send machines, not people, whenever that is possible. So again, it's going to depend on these kinds of factors that tell us whether or not the U.S. can continue to support. I believe strongly we should. Again, bipartisan majorities in each of our houses believe that way. We'll see what happens with the elections in the fall and whether that really does affect things or not. I mean, look, I'm with Ben Hodges, my old comrade here, who thinks that what we should be doing is announcing how do we enable Ukraine to win, not just to sustain their current situation or stabilize the lines. And that would include accelerating decisions. You noted, again, the U.S. response has been impressive, but a number of different decisions took far too long. Tanks, Army tactical missile system, Western aircraft, on and on. Eventually, in every case, we did accede to the Ukrainian request. We agreed. But there was a cost involved in that, and that was that they didn't have capabilities that they desperately needed during last summer's ground counteroffensive, noting that the offensive that has mattered really to them often overlooked is their success in the Black Sea, where they've used a combination of air drones, maritime drones, anti-ship missiles, and some other capabilities, undoubtedly supported by intelligence, perhaps from other countries, to take out 1/3 the entire Black Sea fleet and to force the withdrawal of the Black Sea fleet from the western part of the Black Sea, which enables Ukraine, once again, to export grain by ship, much more efficient and effective, cost effective. And that is crucial not just to the fiscal situation of Ukraine, but also, frankly, to food security for Egypt and a number of other African countries. This is 25% of the world's grain exports from Ukraine. So that's very significant. There's another big issue out there that I'd love to see resolved, and that is for the Western countries in whom Russia has deposited $300 billion equivalent of reserves, if that could be provided to Ukraine. Right now, it appears that in the week or two ahead, the countries will come together and say, give Ukraine the interest on this, which in and of itself is many billions of dollars, but not the tens or hundreds of billions that they really need. So again, there's a whole bunch of factors here that you have to look at and about which you have to ask questions. But the two that matter most right now are filling this U.S. pipeline as quickly as is possible, because no one else can do this in the industrial strength scale that we can. And then Ukraine getting its forced generation process, systems, organizations cranked into very high gear so that they, after they stabilize these front lines and then withstand the expected summer counteroffensive, that they can put themselves in a position where they can start taking ground back from Russia once again, but not doing it in the way that they tried it last summer. That clearly is invalidated because of the presence of drones over top of the forces that are trying to breach these obstacles. We say, in our doctrine, you have to have air superiority to do that. They didn't even have air parity.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the clarity and the detail. Now, going a bit beyond Ukraine, but staying in the region, the Black Sea region, which is the subject also of this conference, And you mentioned how much what happens in the Black Sea can affect the rest of the world. Unlike it was said before at this conference, unlike what happens in Vegas stays in Las Vegas, what happens in the Black Sea doesn't stay in the Black Sea, and no one should put that Black Sea security and stability at the roulette, so to say.
Same in the Middle East, by the way. There were three truths about the Middle East when I was commanding Central Command. One is, know who your enemies are and who your friends are, and don't ever confuse the two of them. Iran is an enemy. Number two is what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. Las Vegas rules don't apply. They tend to spew violence, extremism, instability, and refugees not only into neighboring countries but all the way into our European allies. And then the third was that trying to leave the Middle East as the United States is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in. So just give it up, stay there, and deal with it. But clearly, what happens in the Black Sea doesn't stay there. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from this, one of which is the vulnerability of anything on the surface and above. And again, we've got to look at that hard. What is it that the force structure should be? Should it be the traditional navies of the past, or should it be maritime drones together with air drones, together with intelligence systems, and submarine systems and others, including drones that can operate underwater, which is very, very challenging because, of course, you can lose GPS, and so you have to have some form of advanced positioning, navigation, and timing. But there's a lot to be learned by watching what's going on out there, keeping in mind that this is a unique situation in that the Montreux Convention prevents warships from transiting the Bosphorus at a time of war, and Turkey enforces that. And therefore, it's much more difficult for Russia to replace these ships that they have lost than otherwise might be the case, noting that they could move some from the Caspian. You could even move them from the Baltic if you do the labyrinthine rivers and canals and everything else to get them down here. But I just don't think that they have enough there, much less surplus to provide to the Black Sea.
Well, thanks for this perspective. So I think what you're saying, we still need to continue with the debate of what we need to stabilize better the security and to bring more stability into the Black Sea. Is there any, I mean, if you take layers, political layer, cooperation, armaments, and I would say capabilities, how would you structure the needs?
Well, I think the political, in large measure, has been taken, if you will. So this is the 2022 new NATO strategic concept. This is the, again, North Atlantic Council, essentially. Then the Vilnius Summit, which you now have SAC Europe, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, puts forward his broad approach. For the first time in about 30 years, NATO forces actually are going to have the kind of structure, organizational architecture, orientation that we had during the Cold War. But keep in mind that that means that anybody who's only been in uniform for 30 years has no reference architecture. But, you know, again, when Ben and I and a couple of others in this room were, you know, on the inter-German border, that was a real force structure there. Again, you had the Northern Army Group and the Central Army Group. You had then the British Army of the Rhine. You had all these two entire U.S. Army corps, V and 7, German corps, all the other forces in there. And this is roughly what we're going to try to achieve, of course, out again in the eastern flank, if you will, noting that there's a northern presence now that's very transformed with the addition of Finland and Sweden. And of course, you've got a southern area as well. But operationalizing that's what needs real focus. And that's going to take real force structure, real, again, organizational structure, real logistics, real ramping up of military industrial capacity and capabilities, and doing all this while also transforming forces on the basis of lessons learned by the one country that is actually fighting Russia, which is, of course, Ukraine. And noting that if Russia were ever to prevail in Ukraine, Moldova would be next. Of course, you have borders with both Ukraine and Moldova, the longest border, I think, of any country with Ukraine, and obviously with Moldova as well. And after that, it's going to be Lithuania or one of the Baltic states. So there's an urgency here, an imperative both to support Ukraine and ensure that Russia cannot achieve its objectives there, and really, ideally, again, to ensure that Ukraine can retake its territory, gonna have to work through that. But then also, how do you transform your forces? How do you reestablish something that NATO hasn't had for 30 years, during which it was largely a crisis contingency response force operating in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, against pirates off the coast of Somalia, Libya, and so forth. Now it's back to defense of Central Europe and Northern and Southern, and reestablishing, to the extent that it is possible, what it is that we used to have in the inter-German border area. Remember, there were 250,000 U.S. men and women in uniform just in Germany back in that day, an incredible density of forces.
Well, thank you very much for, frankly, highlighting this domino effect, and I think we might need to do more to have our publics understand this fact, because it's not just about Ukraine, it's about whole of Europe and transatlantic relationship.
This raises a good point, because of course the document that was approved by the summit in Vilnius is quite highly classified, and it should be. There is an unclassified version, but the question is, or an unclassified presentation, the question is, how broadly has that been disseminated? How much does the public actually understand about the urgency of what's going on, especially in the wake of again, Putin's keep in mind that Putin set out to make Russia great again, and what he's really done is make NATO great again. I mean, he's the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War, and he even pushes two historically neutral countries to join NATO on an urgent basis as well. So, and increasing therefore the amount of territory that he has to defend also with the addition of those two. And I'll note that those two countries have very capable forces. We had contingents from each of them in the coalition in Afghanistan that I was privileged to command at the height of the war there. And they were very, very professional, very well equipped, and highly motivated.
Absolutely, great point. I think if Sweden, after 200 years, got the message of what's happening, we all should do it. I have one last question, and I'll open it up to the audience. And this last question has to do with how do you see the future of the relationship, transatlantic relationship, and this balancing between values-based or transactional, and about the awareness of its value in the U.S. vis-a-vis other U.S. interests, the fact that the U.S. can be stronger in the Pacific and other areas because of this allied relationship with transatlantic allies.
Look, I think there's still a very strong recognition of the value of NATO, the value of the transatlantic relationship, but we have to recognize that the global context has changed. Again, what all our early decades in uniform was all about the transatlantic alliance. Once we left Vietnam, we completely focused on NATO and on Europe, and it's different now. Again, the Indo-Pacific, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest plate in that tent is the plate that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China. But once again, it depends. It also depends on perceptions of how well Europe is doing in meeting the 2% of GDP goal, defending itself, creating more capability for itself, or just drafting in the wake of the Americans. It depends as well just on, again, the sense that we're all in the globe together when it comes to, again, in particular, responding to various actions by China. And I think by and large, there's a lot of alignment there. You see the EU and you see individual European countries as well that are concerned, that have the same concerns we have about Chinese export of overcapacity. That is a major issue, and it is already bringing about renewed protectionism around the world and a variety of other actions for national security reasons, where national security is trumping economics, and then where the concerns about subsidized electric vehicles or a number of other exports that are so exceed the capacity of China that they're going to be cut rate for the rest of the world. And so, again, that's a major development, and we're going to have to navigate this because previous experiences with protectionism have not always ended well. If you think back to Smoot-Hawley and so forth, all of which played a role in the Great Depression. So challenging times ahead. If Europe is generally, again, aligned with the U.S. and vice versa, around values, around principles, around ideals, if it is seen as shouldering its share of the task, then I think that relationship is going to remain very, very strong. And we should also remember, you know, we tend to focus on individual countries when we look at the trade that's done. And in that world, number one trading partner, typically Canada and Mexico, number 1 and 2, because they're inside the North American Free Trade Zone, now the USMCA. Number 3 is China. But if you look at an aggregate, the EU beats all of those. So that significance should not be lost on us either.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Please, Ambassador.
Look at that. The ambassador puts his jacket on before he asks the question.
We were together in Afghanistan, and in Camp Dawn, you remember you gave me the coin when we were training those Afghan commandos together at an industrial scale.
Yes. I mean, 35,000 well-trained, yes, well-equipped, determined, and hard-fighting Afghan commandos.
Together there.
Yep.
In this context, I should like to ask you a question about the concept of as long as it takes. Because in Bucharest Summit 2008, the paragraph 6 of the communique says that we will stand with Afghanistan as long as it takes. That neither us nor our Afghan partners will surrender to extremism and terrorism. But we couldn't achieve that goal, unfortunately, as you also mentioned. Is there a coincidence, or it is a natural linkage that after the red lines in Syria were crossed by the use of chemical weapons, the inaction prompted the occupation and annexation of Crimea, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan prompted the Russian war in Ukraine?
I think these were all factors, as I mentioned earlier. Again, what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. I think in particular, the withdrawal, the decision to withdraw forces, that again, this was easily sustainable. The big idea about sustainability, the metrics are the expenditure of blood and the expenditure of treasure. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months, not because of that horrible diplomatic deal that was done by the previous administration with the Taliban, where we not only give them what they want, we're going to leave, and we force the Afghan government, the elected Afghan government, to release 5,500 Taliban detainees with the understanding that, of course, they're never going to take up arms again, which is exactly what they did, and they helped to enable the Taliban to conduct the multiple offensive operations that eventually brought about the collapse of the Afghan security forces. So no, I think that all of this does factor in. I think Putin saw that and said, you know what, they didn't do much after we did Crimea. Look, they don't have the staying power to stay in Afghanistan, even though, again, it's this tiny number of troops, a lot of drones, and yes, we were frustrated by the situation in Afghanistan, but surely that was vastly preferable to what we see now. Not just the fact that they're starving, that the economy has collapsed, but also what was predictable as well, which is that an Islamist extremist organization will take advantage of this situation, establish sanctuaries, and in this case it's now the Islamic State, not Al-Qaeda, but this enabled them to conduct the operation that killed well over 100 individuals in Russia, intelligence for which we actually shared with the Russians in advance under the duty to warn principle that we have in the U.S. But yes, all of this stuff does come together and serves as an influence in the thinking of individuals who are calculating the pros and cons of a particular action. And I think we have to be very conscious of that. The real issue here, though, is strategic leadership. Those at the very top who were very, very committed in 2006, as you noted, were committed absolutely throughout the Bush administration, under which I had 2 4-star combat commands, and then did not have quite the same degree of commitment in the subsequent administration, and even less in the later one. Actually, the previous one had 2 years where we ramped up in Afghanistan, and then 2 years in which we negotiated this agreement that I said was so heavily flawed. And then the current administration accord announced that it would continue with what was agreed, even though it had reversed many of the other international actions of the previous administration. At the time, I said that we would come to regret that decision, and I believe that we have, and it's tragic.
Thank you. Next question. Please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a very quick question. The Russians are saying that they're ready for the long war. But do you consider that the end of this war might be happening by losing the interest or fading out, as in 2014, and just have a line of contact and some shooting from one or the other side, and this might be the long war? Thank you.
Well, I think it depends on how much we enable Ukraine to not just stabilize its lines, but to begin to push back and so forth. Putin has to be convinced that he's not going to, you know, the old adage about, what was it, back in the Stalinist days, the Russians keep pushing with their bayonets until they find something firm. And we need to enable Ukraine to create something very, very firm, and then something that can actually push back. Only if you get to that would there ever be any possibility of negotiations. Putin is unconcerned with negotiation right now, and I'm not necessarily advocating that, but you obviously have to have a change in the dynamic if you're ever to make that even slightly realistic. But I think it is largely the mind of Putin that has to be convinced here. That's what matters. And getting him to realize that the price that he's paying, keep in mind that yes, his economy is seemingly doing well, but it's really just because they're putting massive amounts of money into the military industrial. The people are going to start to feel this. And then over time, the bigger issues are going to start to emerge. You know, the Western oil producers have withdrawn. So what happens as you start to see the oil fields depleted and the new ones that were going to come online in very difficult terrain, permafrost and everything else, not coming online because the Russians don't have the technology to do that. Some Chinese will try to support that in various ways, but they don't have what Exxon and Total and the other oil majors would have. And then the other issues that they've had, which will be longer term, the loss of many of their best and brightest, outflow of human capital, and so on. Over time, again, if we can sustain this, and we absolutely have to, I think Russia can be convinced that this is not a winning proposition. And the sooner we can get to that realization in the Kremlin, the better.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other question, please? Two questions on the left side. On my left side.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah, thank you. Stefan Meiser, German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. Thank you very much. Great presentation, great discussion. Two questions. What does any US president, if it's Trump or Biden, will expect from the Europeans within the next years in NATO? And if Trump comes, can you imagine a European commander of NATO?
No. I don't think the Europeans want a European commander on NATO because they know that any NATO force is always founded on the capability of the United States military. This is most evident, frankly, when the U.S., we only had 3,500 troops in Afghanistan. Other NATO countries and non-NATO countries had nearly well over double that number, almost triple, and yet they had to withdraw when the U.S. withdrew. And it's because there's some basic capabilities that are present without which Europe really can't do the really heavy-duty missions alone. If you think about everything that we did, not just during the Cold War, but also subsequent to that, maybe even more so subsequent to it. But if you think of Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, Afghanistan, and so forth, all these out-of-area contingency missions, in most of the cases, certainly in all the difficult ones, the U.S. foundation was absolutely essential, and you typically had a U.S. commander of that foundation. Even Libya, which remember was spearheaded by the French and the British initially, became a NATO operation. I think we even had to loan bombs to different countries that were running out of bombs. We had to do all this combat search and rescue, had to do most of the really demanding missions. And I think that is exemplary of the challenge that we face. To come back to the first part of your question, the real question is there, do European countries get so serious about this that they all meet what was agreed at the Wales summit a decade or so ago to spend 2% of GDP on defense? And congratulations to Germany, which used to be the poster child for not doing what it needed to do, even though it was running a fiscal surplus, and now it has stepped up to the plate. The Zeitenwende has been, we applaud that very vigorously. Yes, we know there's dynamics in the Bundestag that are going to, this is not going to be easy, nor is it easy, of course, in the US Congress in certain respects. But that is a huge change, and it corresponds with Germany becoming the number 3 economy in the world, surpassing Japan. So again, very, very significant. NATO Secretary General often points out how many more countries have increased in getting to 2% of GDP. But as long as there's those that don't, that plays into the hands of the critics of NATO and those who are the detractors of it. So again, as someone who is a huge believer in it, who was part of NATO from the very first assignment in an airborne infantry battalion in Vicenza, Italy, that was part of the Allied Command Europe Mobile Force, and we would have jumped into Red Square if they had given us the order to back in those days. And ever since, with NATO assignments repeatedly during that time, as I mentioned earlier, including 1, 3, and 4-star positions, my hope is that everyone demonstrates the seriousness that the times call for, including my own country and every country over here. Thank you.
Thank you. Was a question, Mr. Ionita, please?
Ionita is my name. As you mentioned before, Republic of Moldova, it will be next if Russia succeeds. And taking into consideration the worst case scenario, if Russian forces advances in the southern part, Odessa and Danube, putting Republic of Moldova in an existential threat, can we have any solution to help Republic of Moldova?
Well, there's a lot of work going on now, as you know, in a variety of different ways, both in terms of economic assistance, security assistance, diplomatic assistance. First is the election that's coming up, and we need to all touch wood when we see it. But more importantly is all the governments need to be helping what is really quite a pro-Western government in Moldova right now, in ensuring that it retains its position and isn't undermined by Russian information operations, propaganda, misinformation, the presence of troops still in Transnistria and the rest of this. And you've got to get through that first. I think there's a keen awareness of that. The diplomats clearly recognize it, leaders in Europe do, and so forth, and that's crucially important. I would question, though, I don't think it is as easy to get to Odessa as people thought it was. In fact, you have to remember, they didn't even get through Mykolaiv, which is a very, very sent from central casting location for defense. And the Ukrainians demonstrated enormous determination there. It also happened to have a really good political leader and a really good military leader on the ground, and they stopped the Russians cold right there. And then, of course, they were pushed back out of the portion of Kherson that was west of the Dnipro River. That's a much more formidable task. Now, unfortunately, what the Russians can do and have been doing is targeting the maritime infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and so forth in Odessa. And so, again, that's another area where the improvements in air and ballistic missile defense are desperately needed. But the idea that they'd march right across that southern coast, which seemed almost a tiny bit inevitable at one point early on in this latest iteration of invasion, I think showed very, very impressively what Ukrainian forces can do, and particularly in certain areas where they're defending urban areas.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I think it actually says
yes,
0000 here. I think we're supposed to take a hint from that.
Sorry.
Oh. One more. Last question. Actually, somebody
there are
else.
Two last ones.
I'm afraid somebody else has the microphone. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Gordan Akrap and I'm from Croatia. General Petrov, since you are quite often visitor of the Balkan area in last years, would you like to be so kind to comment the role of the United States in negotiation process between Serbia and Kosovo, and how do you see the role of the Serbia in future, especially after yesterday's resolution of the UN in Srebrenica? Thank you.
What's interesting here is that I spent a year in the Balkans, based in Bosnia, but also doing operations. I was part of the war criminal hunt and then counterterrorism, and did a fair amount in Serbia. We subsequently at KKR did a very large telecom deal there that was present in all of the different Balkan countries. And it was a 1.5 billion deal. We actually sold it for 2. I had to go to every one of those countries, many of them multiple times, to resolve problems, and so it gave us a bit of a window into this. And what you see are some countries, and I'd argue that yours is one of them, but certainly Slovenia, perhaps some others that are really relatively stable. Yeah, they have political dynamics, and sometimes the president's this party and the prime minister's that, and they don't get along and all that, but it generally is working out. And then you have a couple of places which are somewhat dysfunctional. Sadly, the structure with which we saddled Bosnia is a particular concern to me. And then you have countries that have trended in one direction or the other a bit. You see that to a degree with Serbia, where the truth is that President Vučić really would like to align towards the EU, but the culture, the traditions, the history, lineage, and all this stuff sort of keep pulling him back a bit toward Russia. Look, I'm hopeful that the U.S. or whomever, together with the EU, other countries, could finally resolve these issues between Kosovo and Serbia. It's one of these cases where it doesn't appear to be as hard as it actually is. You know, you can sketch out a pretty reasonable approach, except, of course, trying to sell it to the handful of individuals in the actual locales. That proves to be a little bit more difficult. You know, the old adage, where you stand depends on where you sit. And if you actually sit in these areas, these are much more intractable. So I don't know whether to have much optimism, frankly, about how this can be resolved, whether it can be resolved. I fear that this is one of those issues that's just so emotional, and so therefore politically it's like the third rail that you don't want to touch in politics, and that's my fear, because it's one I'd love to see resolved in the same way that the challenges between what was then the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia and Greece were finally resolved. And what did that? Great leadership in 2 countries that was willing to take risk. I'm not sure I see that dynamic present right now when it comes to Serbia and Kosovo. And then, unfortunately, the diplomatic leadership of the United States is really pretty seized with what's going on in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in the Indo-Pacific, and a handful of other places that just are higher priority, unfortunately, if you were trying to get this one resolved.
Thank you. And Ambassador, last questions, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Ukrainian ambassador in Bucharest, and first, General, I would like to thank you for your insights in assessing the situation relating to the ongoing Russia's war against Ukraine. One point that I would like to take out, this relates to this notion of supporting Ukraine to not let Russia prevail or achieve its objectives. We, of course, look differently at it, and that we expect that Ukraine will be enabled to prevail over Russia, to defeat the Russian aggression, and also to restore control over its sovereign territories. Putting the question to you, is this logic also kind of guiding within the establishment, be it in the United States or elsewhere among the partners? And what, in your view, needs to be done to help Ukraine to make possible achieve this particular objective of defeating the Russian Federation in its war against Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, let me, first of all, thank you for what you're doing for your country. Command, again, I think I mentioned earlier, I've been there 3 times in the last year alone, and we usually go and stay for at least 4 or 5 days and have a reasonable sense of the situation, how perilous it was the last time I was there before the conscription law had been agreed and before the U.S. assistance had been agreed. Obviously, a somewhat more optimistic picture now. Look, I absolutely want to see Ukraine provided everything that it needs to be able to prevail and to do that. I think there's an issue here, though, that Ukraine does. I've mentioned this repeatedly. Your whole fourth generation process has to be gotten into higher gear. That is absolutely crucial. And the months that were taken up by the very emotional debate in the Rada over this issue were, I think, a bit costly as well. And the world is, the informed world is watching to see whether Ukraine can come out of this and develop rotational policies for its forces, unit activations, individual replacements, all the rest of this, so that if the weapons are there, as Andrei Yermak said, if the weapons are there, the people will be there, that actually is validated. Again, while I say that I want to see everything done to enable Ukraine to prevail, I've also got to be realistic. And, you know, a CIA director, a commander of two different wars, you realize that you have to deal with the world the way that it is, not the way you'd like it to be. I very much embrace what Ben Hodges has repeatedly said about we need a strategy for victory, not just a strategy for, again, preventing Russia. I'm not sure whether that is possible with the levels of resources that are reasonable to expect. And that's the challenge. There have to be some other dynamics. The technology race could be one answer to this. There could be additional policies, accelerating decisions, as I mentioned, on allowing use of U.S. weapons into Russian airspace if those weapons are being used against Kharkiv and so forth and so on. So this is a complex issue, and I'd like to have a nice simplistic issue that said we're all going to link arms and enable you to win your war of independence. I hope that we do that, and I am personally heavily invested in trying to publicly advise our Congress, our policymakers, and even in other countries as well. And I will continue to do that. But I don't know that I can guarantee that all of our actions together will be enough to galvanize the kind of action that is necessary, and also to galvanize the kind of force generation that is required on the part of Ukrainians for you to prevail in the way that we would like you to do so.
Well, thank you very much indeed, General Petraeus. This has been a fascinating discussion, and you came with a lot of insight and also wisdom. So therefore, I think I can speak on behalf of this audience in terms of expressing the gratitude and also inviting everyone for a round of applause.